All right, so full transparency, I don't really care that much about the Wheel of Time show. Um, I've tried getting into the books. I've tried reading the series. I've only gotten about 3 books in. Um, the story still hasn't quite grabbed me yet. At some point, I will go through the entire series, but at this point in time, the series hasn't grabbed me, and I don't particularly care about the show that much. I just don't really like it. Um, my personal view is that Amazon just isn't very good at pulling off fantasy. Not live action fantasy at any rate. Um, Amazon is much better at doing things like fantasy with animation. That's just my view. So I've kind of got mixed feelings on this show to begin with. I'm not thrilled about it. For the most part, I'm reviewing the show for my own benefit so that I can figure out this whole YouTube thing, editing, how this thing works. And I know I need to work on getting this figured out because it's not perfect at all. So consider this an exercise more than a serious review. There's other movies and shows that I do care about that I will probably actually put some effort into analyzing. This video, take it with a grain of salt. I'm kind of reviewing the show as a normie because I don't care all that much. Um and I don't know that I'm necessarily a Wheel of Time fan quite yet, if that makes sense. Take that and do with it as you will. So I guess with that aside, with that said, let's get into the review. Wheel of Time, Season 2, Episode 1. So the episode opens with a little girl who's in the. She's apparently been captured by the Dark One from the end of Season 1. And she is chased by Trollocs, and then um, she goes inside the building, and the Dark One picks her up. I know it's not the Dark One. Before you go into the comments, I know it's not actually the Dark One. She goes inside. The Dark One picks her up, takes her out, and then talks to her about monsters. And he stands in front of this Trolloc and asks her, "Do I look like a monster?" And gives this whole speech about monsters. And this whole time, I got this creepy feeling like he was going to feed her to the Trolloc, especially when he asks, "Do I look like a monster?" I almost feel like that was a missed opportunity. That is one pet peeve I have, not just with this show, but also with the Rings of Power, is there's a lot of missed opportunities for storytelling, for making a point, and really driving certain things home. So to a degree, that felt a little bit like a missed opportunity. Um, I'm not gonna. One other point I do want to make is I'm not really gonna go into the inconsistencies between the show and the books. I know there's a ton. This show is not accurate to the books at all. Even from what I remember, the limited knowledge that I remember from the first 3 books, the show does not follow the books pretty much at all. Um, so I'm not gonna come at it from that perspective. There's others like Shad from Night's Watch that certainly is a much bigger Wheel of Time fan than I am, who is going to go at it from the perspective of adhering to the lore, of adhering to the story, to the canon, to the source material. That's not what I'm going to do here. Like I said, this video is kind of more is more being put out by me for practice and figuring out this whole YouTube thing. I know, and as far as the other YouTubers, there's also Daniel Green, who would I believe he's a little more favorable to the show than Shad. So he'll probably potentially give a very reasonable review to the show. Um, and he seems a little more open to the show not following the books by the letter. Shad certainly seems to have an issue with the show not being accurate. I understand that completely. That's my feeling as far as say Rings of Power, which I think is a terrible show. But I'm going down a rabbit hole. I apologize. So after that opening with the little girl, we end up we are reintroduced to Moraine, who in the end of season one lost her connection to the One Power. Before I go on, I do want to say I think Rosamund Pike is by far the strongest performance. She gives the strongest performance in the show. And based on the Moraine that I remember from the books, she brings that character out very well. So I think she is probably the perfect casting. The other two that I think are pretty decent, are pretty good, are the actresses for Nynaeve and Egwene. They seem to be pretty close personality wise to the characters from the book. Lan's kind of hit and miss, some more miss than hit, to be honest. Rand is just no, he looks the part, but that's about it. Um, there were issues with Matt from what I remember. Perrin from season one had, I think, the most interesting character journey. Again, they changed it significantly from the book, but he did have the most interesting character progression based on what I remember. But even those three, from what I remember from the books, they there were some issues. I don't think the casting is perfect. On the topic of Trollocs, I will give this to Amazon. They know how to do monsters. They know how to get the visual design down. The orcs and Rings of Power are almost perfect. The Trollocs here, again, almost perfect. A combination or a blending of practical and computer effects. They're they're really good. I will give that to Amazon as far as that aspect goes. They're very good at giving you realistic, scary, convincing monsters. So after Moraine meets with Doman, we see a scene where. So we see a very important scene that kind of sets the tone for the rest of the episode. And in this scene, we see Egwene and Nynaeve, and they're at I think the city is Tarvalon. Basically, it's the Aes Sedai city, and they're novices. Anyway, we see them in the kitchen, and they've been clearing dishes, and they're down there, and they're cleaning and doing all this stuff. And one of the Aes Sedai elders, one of the teachers, comes down and starts instructing them on doing a weave with the One Power. And they take dirty dishwater and they run it through a weave from the One Power. And then when the water comes through the other end of the weave, it's clean water. She's doing this basically saying, you're going to drink this water, and you either do the weave or you're drinking dirty water. So all the other girls, they practice this weave, and they do that, and they're drinking clean water. Nynaeve, however, is having some issues. She hasn't been able to access the One Power ever since the end of season one. She just can't do it. So there's a little bit of a confrontation between her and this this Aes Sedai elder woman, and Nynaeve finally says, basically, you know what, screw you, and she drinks the dirty water and she runs out because the stipulation was you're not leaving this room until you drink your water, whether clean or dirty, basically. So Nynaeve does that and leaves. And that is a pretty important scene that has a payoff later on. We then get another scene with the Red Aja where they're talking about Nynaeve and Egwene, specifically talking about how Nynaeve showed that she had so much power at the battle in the last episode from season one, and they're trying to figure out how to get her to come out of her shell, as it were. And the Red Aja lady, evil Red Aja lady, is like, let me give it a try. Let me see if I can figure out how to get her to to perform a weave. And they basically tell her like, no, you got a novice killed under your care at one point. So that's that scene, and that's also giving us setup. Next, we cut to Perrin and Loyal, and they are apparently on the hunt for the Horn of Valier. And they're discussing Podon Fane, um, the guy who stole the horn in the end of season one, and they're chasing him. This was the same person who was in the Two Rivers, who brought the Trollocs down on the Two Rivers in episode one of season. Anyhow, they come across a scene where a bunch of people are dead, they're slaughtered. There's a figure there who tells them, basically Podon Fane did this, and Perrin has another wolf vision where he sees a little girl running away from the scene. And in his vision, it appears to be the same girl that was in the intro to the episode. Cut back to Moraine talking with Master Doman, and he presents her with this white stone that apparently has writing on the back of it, and it had apparently it's from a sundial or some type of dial, maybe a sundial, and apparently this dial had a poem written on the back of it, and he essentially tells her like, I will give you this stone for 50 marks. I also have a copy of the poem here that was written in like dark speech or whatever, and that's an extra 5 marks. Moraine basically then says, okay, you can keep the stone. I don't care. It doesn't help me, even though, yes, it's magic stone and it's made from the one power. What I really want is that poem. So she gives him the 5 marks and takes that. As he's leaving, he tells her that on the road he saw some figures with black hoods. She asks if he saw their face. No. She then says, I need you to get in your boat and I need you to run like hell. And he's like, what have you gotten me into? And she's like, the wheel weaves as the wheel wills. So it seems like he was followed by the faceless men, by the Nazgul of this world, as it were. Cut back, Nynaeve is sparring with the warders, discussing with them her issues with magic and with some of the other members of the tower. And they're basically sitting there telling her about how hard warder training is. And it struck me, it's kind of interesting how this show focuses so much on warders. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I did find it kind of interesting even in season 1 where they essentially took a whole episode establishing the connection between warders and Aes Sedai. Um, I mean, there were some issues with how they did it, and especially with what they did with Lan's character in that episode, from what I remember. But it is interesting how the show is focusing so much on. Right after that, we see a scene where Egwene goes to the Aes Sedai lady who taught them the weave earlier that day, and she tells her, "Hey, I'm having issues figuring out how to do these weaves. I'm having trouble figuring out how to focus on two things at once." And then we get this whole weird extended conversation about how to make love to two people at once and everything. And Egwene is kind of freaked out, like, I that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I was asking about. I mean, I'm having trouble figuring out how to do the weave. It just felt a little unnecessary and a little forced. Like you're pushing this weird sexual thing in there for, from what I could tell, no reason. So anyway, that's kind of how I saw it. We cut back, and Nynaeve is back down in the kitchen, and she's attempting to do the weave from earlier that day. Then we see the Red Aja lady come in. Remember from earlier where she asked if she could train Nynaeve, and they talk for a minute, and the Red Aja lady basically pushes Nynaeve against the wall using the one power. The whole time, she is taunting her, and she talks about how warders are useless. That's why the Red Aja don't use them. They're useless, they're distractions. And then she starts talking about Lan. Remember in season one, and apparently from the books, Lan and Nynaeve become a thing. So there's a connection there. So she talks about Lan, she taunts Nynaeve about Lan, and then Nynaeve lashes out. She's able to perfectly copy the weave that this Red Aja lady is using and push it back against her. And the Red Aja lady points this out, like, you saw this weave once and you perfectly used it. And then she's basically like, hey, you got power. I want you to be powerful. I want you to get to a point where you can overpower anyone, including me. So then we cut back to Perrin and Loyal, and they're burying the bodies that they came across. And Perrin is discussing Padan Fain, how he would come to the two rivers. He would talk about, or he came to the two rivers, he shared their mead, he laughed with them, and then he led Trollocs to destroy them. Quickly back to Moraine and Lan. Lan throws a hissy fit at Moraine because she's not communicating with him, and she's basically cut him out. Back to Egwene and Nynaeve, they receive a letter from Perrin talking about how it's Beltane. I believe that was the festival from episode 1 of season 1. And they're all reminiscing about home, talking about home, all this stuff. We then the letter talks about, oh, I wonder where Matt is, how he's doing. Then we cut to a scene where we see Matt for the first time, and he's in this dungeon with the same Red Aja lady, and she's basically reading to him a copy of the letter that Nynaeve and Egwene got, but it doesn't mention him at all. So she edited the letter, and she then taunts him and basically is like, "Oh, your friends, they don't care about you, all this sort of thing." So then she berates him and leaves. And one thing I would like to note is, again, we have the new actor playing Matt now, because in the first season, the actor who initially played Matt left the project prematurely. And so that's actually why they had to cut him from the role, or kind of cut the character from the season when they did, because in the books he's with them this entire time. He doesn't get separated with them from them until a bit later, I believe. So that is something to remember. And with this whole letter, at one point in the letter, they talk about how Rand is dead. He died saving us from the Dark One. He died in his battle with the Dark One. Then we get a brief scene where Rand steps out of the shadows, doesn't say anything. And I thought this was kind of interesting. Rand is not the main character in this show. And this kind of proved it to me because he shows up once in the first episode of season 2, doesn't say a thing. The show seems to be about everyone except Rand. And I know from the books, Rand is the main character. He is the focus because he's the dragon reborn. So I just thought that was interesting. The show is about literally everyone except Rand. So finally, we cut back to Moraine. She runs away. Right as Lan is about to come back around, after he's thrown his hissy fit, he comes back around, and then she leaves. They don't make up or anything. They don't talk or anything like that. She just leaves. She runs into one of the faceless men, and it's a little cat and mouse game in the shadows for a little bit. She stabs one in the face, another one pops out, slices her in the gut. Then Lan pops out of nowhere, cuts that one's head off, and then like 2 or 3 others pop out, and then it's a fight between Lan and those 3. And then Lan gets wounded over and over and over again. It looks like he might die, he might get killed. And then we get a brief tease where it looks like Moraine might be getting her powers back. And they teased this earlier in the episode as well when she was in the bath and she like held her hand above the water, and for a moment you thought, oh, maybe she would be able to make a weave with the water, but that didn't happen. That was the beginning of the episode. Here we see a weave forming right under her hand as Lan is about to get killed. But rather than her getting her powers back, because this ends up being a misdirect, rather than getting her powers back, we see the Aes Sedai and the warder that Lan and Moraine have been staying with at this house somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. They pop out and they dispatch of the faceless men and save Moraine and Lan. And then the episode ends. So that's episode 1, season 2 of The Wheel of Time on Amazon. And it wasn't bad, but I wouldn't call it good. For me, the gold standard, at least right now, the gold standard of television seems to be The House of the Dragon, which was just brilliant from start to finish. Like the entire show, episode by episode, was like 9s out of 10s the whole time, except for maybe one episode. This, I think I'm leaning towards probably a 5 or 6 out of 10. Not bad, not awful, but just doesn't have that wow factor. It it might have been a bit of a step up from season 1. At some point in time, I'm gonna have to go back and rewatch season 1 and record my thoughts and my review of it. But for right now, I think I'm leaning towards a 5 or a 6 out of 10 for episode 1. So, yeah, with that said, um, that's my review of Wheel of Time, season 2, episode 1. Until next time, thanks for watching.